I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, why are environmental activists under attack? We will discuss a new report that looks at the threats faced by defenders of the land and its resources.
How are environmental activists treated in your country? You can tell us via Twitter or in our live YouTube chat.
Hi everyone, my name is Varshini Prakash from Sunrise Movement, and you are in the stream.
Last year, at least 164 environmental activists around the world were killed and countless more were silenced through violent attacks, intimidation or unfair criminalisation. That is according to a new report by the UK-based human rights group Global Witness. The report examined 19 countries and found that most of the killings were of activists who spoke out against the mining industry. People protesting hydropower projects and land disputes with agribusiness were also met with deadly attacks. The report also highlights the threats indigenous communities in particular face from resource extraction industries and the growing trend by governments to label environmental protectors as eco-terrorists.
So in this episode, we'll look at the struggles faced by environmental activists and ask what should be done to protect their work. With us to talk about this via Skype in London, Heather Iqbal, Senior Communications Advisor with Global Witness. In Sao Paulo, Carlos Riddle, he's the Executive Secretary of the Brazilian Climate Observatory, a coalition of civil society organizations. And in Manila, Victoria Tauli Corpuz, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She is an indigenous leader from the Kankanay Igorot people in the Philippines. Welcome to the stream, all of you. I want to start with the expertise of some of our community members because our viewers know what they're talking about. So the Philippines, noted in this tweet from Leon here, is the deadliest country in the world right now for environmental defenders, and he explains, in his view, why. His organization recorded a total of 223 Filipino environment defenders killed from 2001 to 2008. He says 58.3% of them were involved in anti-mining activity, followed by opponents of agribusiness. The presence of these extractive industries is by far the biggest driver of violence against defenders. But he goes on to say, and this is interesting, Victoria, he says, these brave martyrs stood in defense of more than 2.6 million hectares of land and seascapes. The majority of these came from indigenous people and farmers resisting land grabs. So indigenous peoples and farmers, this sounds like a big umbrella when we say environmental defenders. Who are we talking about when it comes to the Philippines?
Well, we are talking about 15 million indigenous peoples, and of course, maybe more than that, a bigger number of that of farmers. So they also there are indigenous peoples who are also farmers. So it's a combination of two groups of people who are basically working the land, depending on the land and surviving on it.
Heather, I'm just looking at the Global Witness report here, Enemies of the State, ? And what you did was take out just not the numbers and the reporting that you've seen of how many people have been attacked or died or been criminalized, but you made it personal so that we, as the international community, could see what was happening. I want us to do that all the way through this show. So take us to Guatemala, a community that was protesting a dam. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So one of the key case studies covered in our report this year covered the story of Neri and Domingo Esteban Pedro, two brothers who were really violently killed following their vocal opposition and peaceful protest to a hydropower dam. Now they're the third people in their community to be killed, linked to this. Their community has been and continues to be intimidated, threatened by violence. This hydropower dam, the projects associated with it were polluting the water, they were destroying food crops, fish crops, and to be honest, causing a huge impact on the indigenous community that lived in that area. So it's a really stark and quite a horrible example of the sharp end of these kind of attacks, which can start with criminalisation and intimidation and threats and sort of end in such horrible killings.
Carlos, I'm just thinking about some of the situations where these local communities are in. It's the industries coming into their environment, polluting their environment, and then they're protesting. It's not as if they're activists on purpose. It's because something has been done to them. For instance, mercury poisoning. Carlos, tell us about the communities that are suffering from mercury poisoning.
I'll give you one example. In the Yanomami indigenous groups that is found in the northern Amazon, Brazilian Amazon, they estimated that there are 20,000 illegal miners within their lands, poisoning the rivers by using mercury. And some of the health institutes in Brazil estimates that more than 50% of the Yanomami population is contaminated with mercury due to the use of this substance for gold mining. And we are speaking about 20,000 people illegally established in their lands.
I'm also thinking about indigenous people who are so often in areas where there is mining, there's hydroelectricity, there's extraction. And I wanted to share with you one story and how the indigenous community there are trying to fight back. So we go to Brazil for that, and an indigenous Jazeera tribe. And in this clip, you'll hear from the locals there how they're managing when there's logging in their area. Have a look.
We got together and organised a team to protect the territory. We were worried, and are worried, about future generations, and about the isolated tribes that we have never seen. Our grandparents told us that there are people there, and that they need protection. Also, they said that these people need us. They need the forest, and we need the forest too.
Victoria, are you finding that it's indigenous communities that are suffering the most from their lands being encroached upon?
Yes, I do find that, especially because many of the indigenous peoples that I have been meeting in different parts of the world are the ones who really are resisting the kinds of development that we see, like mining, as well as expansion of agricultural plantations, and also big infrastructure projects that are usually pushed by the government. So these are communities that are highly vulnerable, and a big percentage of them are the ones who are killed, as well as subjected to false criminal charges and brought to pre-trial detention for many years. So this is the picture that I've seen, and I think that it's because of the fact that they were defending these lands before, and now, with the increasing decrease of lands which will be exploited, they are now the ones being attacked in many countries.
I want to share this comment we got on YouTube from someone watching live. This is Elizabeth, who says environmental issues seem to be connected to class and race issues as well. Like in Brazil, Bolsonaro encouraging miners to invade indigenous lands in Brazil and claiming it's to make these cultures modern. So that's one take right there, because you saw that earlier video from Brazil. But I want to move to a different part of the world and still keep this on indigenous communities, because of course it's not just Brazil. I want to share this comment we got from David Gilbert. He's a political ecologist talking about what communities in Indonesia face. Have a listen.
In places like Indonesia and Sumatra in particular, the risks that indigenous peoples and smallholder family farmers face as they seek to defend their lands, forests, and waters are very grave. There, industrial agricultures especially use violence and coercion to force people off the land and destroy existing ecologies. State military work with agribusiness mercenaries and militia to murder a few of these people every year, and thousands more are arrested. But still, these people, these defenders and protectors, are joining up by the hundreds of thousands in unions and social mobilization organizations, and they'll continue their struggle until these commodities are produced in a way that's free of bloodshed.
So Heather, he ends that video on a hopeful note, but in the comment he says that these communities are facing murder, mercenaries, and militias. These are dangerous circumstances. What recourse do they have, especially when it comes to indigenous communities and the risks they're facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, particularly inspiring to sort of hear from the clip before from the indigenous community in Brazil around how they're being extremely active on mobilizing to protect not just their community, but the communities around them, and they feel the responsibility of that. And I think the really important thing here is that land and environmental defenders are not just fighting for their own protections, they're fighting for all of us. You know, when they protect the forests in that part of Brazil, they're helping save the planet from climate breakdown, which is a huge issue, as we know. So I think that that's the first thing to say, that, you know, not only are they facing these huge threats in the face of protecting their own land, but they are also protecting the environment for all of us. And I think that in order for them to continue to fight with success, you know, we have seen in some places numbers have fallen. That might obscure the fact that there are still huge threats against land and environmental defenders. But, you know, people like Victoria herself, land and environmental defenders themselves, campaign groups, NGOs, all of these people have been campaigning so hard and raising awareness. And now it's up to all of us to stand with defenders and amplify their stories on their terms, to kind of link into the sort of important intersectionality you talked about before, and make sure that we're telling their stories and that we're holding businesses and governments to account so that they don't have to do that fight on their own.
Carlos, when you think about it, it's outrageous that people living in their own country, on their own land, would be murdered from outsiders and companies and industries coming in and being in their home. It's outrageous that that would even happen. Can you explain why?
Well, actually, it's because especially the lack of law enforcement, the lack of the presence of the government on the ground. For example, indigenous lands are public lands in Brazil, and so it's a duty from the federal government to protect those lands, to prevent that these lands are invaded by illegal miners, illegal loggers, and whenever this happens, they should go there and take these people out of those lands. And but at this moment, what we are facing right now in Brazil is exactly the opposite. As you said before, the government, the President Bolsonaro himself is saying that he will manage to incentivize the mining within indigenous lands, and this would bring additional threats, additional violence against those people. As the case we have recently in the state of Amapá, when the indigenous chief of one tribe was murdered and killed by illegal miners that invaded his land. He was stabbed and taken to death because of 50 illegal miners invaded those lands, and it was a peaceful land before. And this incentivation, the government incentivizing this sort of actions, illegal activities, goes deep turns the situation even worse.
When it comes to the why, I have a commenter who would agree with what you just mentioned there. This is Kaveh Madani. He's a senior fellow at Yale, and he talks to us about why he thinks this is happening. Have a listen.
Generally, we can identify two major reasons for the growing criminalization, securitization, and politicization of the environmental space. The first one is rooted in the conflicts between the economic and development objectives of governments, businesses, and industries, and environmental protection. The second one, and the emerging one, which we see more and more around the world, is related to the fact that governments, political players, and intelligence units have realized that environment has the power to unite people regardless of their ideologies, political beliefs, and ethnicities.
So, Victoria, Kaveh, there's also the former deputy head of Iran's Department of Environment. What do you make of his comment, this two-pronged approach to why this is happening?
Well, I think it's exactly that. Those are the reasons that these things are happening. There's a conflict usually between how states think of development. Usually they think about this in terms of economic growth. So extraction is the way to grow and to export the products that come from those communities. And secondly, the absence of the state. Indeed, in many communities, in many countries where I have visited, usually you don't even see any kind of, say, court inside those communities, nor even police authorities. So the ones who do these functions, these actions are usually the paramilitary or the security of the companies, security guards of the companies, and this was very clearly seen, for instance, in the case of Berta Cáceres in Honduras, who was killed in 2017, and she was, and it's the company, the security guards who have been arrested and put in jail. But that only came about after more than a year of investigation. So this is a common situation that we see everywhere, and it's so unfortunate because the state is the duty bearer to protect human rights, but they are not doing this role.
Victoria, we asked you to send us some pictures so that we could really get a sense of what is happening to local communities and their land. And you sent us this picture. Have a look, everybody, on my laptop. And this is in Ecuador. And what we're seeing is oil pollution. Victoria, speak to us about this and the impact it's having on the people who live there.
Yes, this is in Lago Agrio, in Sucumbíos province in Ecuador. And they brought me to this community to show how polluted their lands are. So it's not just the waters, it's also the soil. And therefore, they cannot do any kind of agriculture in these lands. And they have never been compensated by the companies who caused this pollution. So the people are really in a very bad state because aside from not being able to produce for their very survival, they are also being harassed every time.
Heather, go ahead.
I think, I think just to echo everything that Victoria's just said, and also I think one of the sort of allusions that Cave made was around sort of the people who finance this kind of destruction. So not just the companies who should be doing, better due diligence, who should be making sure that they are protecting the communities who live on the land where they're planning a project, but who is it that's pumping money into these projects? Who are the investors who are kind of sitting comfortably and putting money into projects that they're making profit from by that economic model which Cave spoke about, and the measures on which they should be held to account. Company responsibility is extremely important, and so is investor and government responsibility. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind too.
Of course, it is important. I think our community would agree with that, but there are still so many hurdles. So I wanted to share just this one. This is Nikos, who says, standing in the way of private plunder and the corrupt government that enables and benefits from such is treated as subversive activity. Environmental stewardship can't happen without legal protections enforced by the impartial administration of justice. And so corruption being one of those things standing in the way. Victoria, of course, you know this firsthand. You know what it's like to be labeled as someone standing in the way when it comes to government, because you were labeled a quote-unquote terrorist yourself. Talk to us about that.
Yes, last year, in March 8th of last year, I saw a list of people included in a petition by the government to declare the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army as a terrorist organization. So I was shocked when I saw my name included in a list of more than 600 people. And so I filed a case against the government asking them to clarify exactly what my status was in that list, because as the UN Special Rapporteur, I'm supposed to enjoy immunity from attacks by the government, but I was in that list, and of course I was in a very high risk situation. So for some time I had to leave out of the country.
Let's talk about what environmentalists can actually do. They are being labelled as eco-terrorists. But what can they do in return? Let me give you one example. In Madagascar, a dozen environmentalists were in court earlier on this year. They were accused of destroying the businesses of loggers. And what did they do? They took the authorities to court. Have a look.
Pour destruction de la forêt. For the first time, we are taking local authorities to court for abuse of power, for destruction, for the destruction of the forest, defamation, and arbitrary arrests.
Carlos, you represent civil society organizations in Brazil. What are people doing who are defending their land to be able to do that safely and stay alive at the same time?
Well, right now, unfortunately, the level of violence is increasing. What they are trying to do is to have their voice heard. They are speaking to lawyers, they are speaking to different civil society organizations, they are trying to speak to authorities. And of course, litigation, as in the case of Madagascar, is one route, but in many cases, even having evidence on what's going on the ground, having the stories told, unfortunately, increased the level of threat over people in some specific areas. This is happening right now in Brazil. There are many cases where people were trying they have to leave their places, their lands. Unfortunately, the place where they lived for ages, because of this level of threat, but connecting with others is critical.
Heather, I could see you trying to jump in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think just to add to that, I think you also see so many organizations mobilizing really effectively and leading incredibly effective and sophisticated campaigns. I mean, we saw a group of indigenous organizations from Brazil, from Mexico, from Indonesia leading a movement where they canoed down the Hudson River to the UN a couple of years ago. You see people campaigning at Terra Libra, creating huge amounts of awareness around this important issue, and getting messages out about exactly what their recommendations are around, for example, specific agribusiness products that they think people need to be aware of buying, and understanding those supply chains. I think those campaigns deserve, a huge amount of credit in terms of, how they're bringing forward this issue and really raising awareness and getting more political attention onto it from across the world.
It's interesting you mentioned political attention. I wanted to bring this in the closing minutes of the show. Victoria, there's a back and forth on Twitter. Bron says we need to find and support frontline eco-defenders and the groups in solidarity with them. The more attention to them, the more difficult it becomes for their enemies to kill them, and journalists can cover them. But he got pushback. Someone else, David on Twitter, says there are many ways to build movement capacities and solidarity, but it's more complicated than media attention equals less risk. Sometimes it is specifically leaders and spokespeople that are targeted, so underground and low profile has to be part of it too. Victoria.
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly true, but it's also what I have seen in several countries is that the indigenous peoples, they assert their authority to be able to control their land. So I have seen, say, community guards. In Mexico, I have seen several communities who have set up their own community guards because they don't trust the police or the army. And so they are the ones guarding their territories. They, of course, file suits before the state because they have also declared their territories as autonomous municipalities, for instance. And being autonomous municipalities, they are the ones who will govern the community and set up the security forces that will protect themselves. So there are community efforts that are actually stopping these kinds of behavior from companies and from the state. And I think that is where we see a lot of hope as well.
Looking at this report and the total number of killings per country, it only looks, the Global Witness report only looks at 19 countries. Not every single death or attack or criminalization is even reported, but the stats from 2018, knowing that they're not completely full there, every week 3 people are murdered because they are trying to defend their land. I am just thinking, Carlos, if you could just give us one thought about that. What can we do as an international community? Just one thought.
Well, giving these people a voice, whenever there is an announcement, is to have this message spread out, to really hit hard governments and companies that need to get held accountable for their responsibility over any case.
Sure. Carlos, Victoria, Heather, thank you so much. That's all the time we have. Thanks for watching. Malik and I were always online at AJ Stream on Twitter. See you next time.